Thank you. Thank you. All right. Bonjour. Hello, Ani. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, I would, I would like to share a bit about myself, my heritage, and recognize the ancestral history of the place where I come from. So my name, Hannah McCurdy-Adams, Indigenous cause. My name is Hannah McCurdy-Adams. I use the pronouns she and her. I grew up in Ontario, exploring the rivers, lakes, and the Niagara Escarpment. I'm a second to at least fifth generation settler Canadian with ancestors from England, Ireland, Scotland, and the Ukraine. Some of my ancestors emigrated to Canada in 1863 from Ireland and were some of the first European settlers in what is now the municipality of Erin-Elderslie Township in Bruce County in Western Ontario. I do not know my clan. I am the Reptile and Amphibian Program Development Coordinator with Wildlife Preservation Canada and a co-chair for the Canadian Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnake Recovery Implementation Group. I want to pay my respects to many nations, including the Massasaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Métis Nations, who were the first keepers and current residents of the land where I currently live. I'm in an area covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement and Treaty 13. I also want to express my gratitude to those who have guided me to see nature from a perspective that is different from my own.
Ada Maloney and Dishnakas. My name is Ada Maloney and I use the pronouns he and him. I'm a Master's of Science candidate in the Litskasab at Laurentian and I'm the other co-chair of SEMRIG. Similar to Hannah, I grew up in Ontario and I live in what is currently known as Toronto. Traditionally, this land is the territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Massasaugas of the Credit First Nation, and Massasaugas people under the Toronto Purchase and Treaty 13. Even through a virtual platform, I would like all of us to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands and cultural significance of wherever we may call home. We all have a role to play in improving relationships between nations, but also in increasing our understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We'd also like to welcome the national and potentially international participants we have joining us virtually today in the experience and heritage they may bring with them. Greetings to everyone here today and your ancestors too. Welcome to you all. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, please do.
And Danelle, next slide.
Just a little bit about SEMRIG. So SEMRIG is focused on collaboratively implementing conservation efforts for the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake in Ontario. So we have approximately 70 members from municipal, provincial, and federal governments, Indigenous nations, universities, consulting companies, zoos, other conservation organizations, and other conservation organizations. We have 5 main objectives that encompass actions that can support almost all the other recommended recovery actions we'll be discussing. So these are our 5 current objectives. Provide a mechanism for networking and collaboration among diverse interests in the conservation of the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. Provide a forum to discuss active projects, the latest research, and coordinated approaches to threat mitigation. Provide expert advice, education, and outreach to organizations and individuals on Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake conservation. Encourage ecosystem-based approaches to Eastern Massasauga recovery and ensure integration of in situ and ex situ efforts in a one-plan approach. And encourage two-eyed seeing approaches that harmonize as many knowledge systems to all actions.
And next slide. So we've introduced ourselves. I'm Hannah, Ada, and Aiden. We are the co-chairs of the Canadian Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnake Recovery Implementation Group. We have 2 working groups, the ex situ and then the community science and outreach one that's hosting this workshop, and 2 recommended working groups who are waiting on folks to step up to chair or co-chair for habitat and for roads. Next slide. And this is for you to know.
All right, thank you, Hannah and Aiden, for the wonderful introduction to SEMRIG and of yourselves, and welcome everybody to the workshop today. You've heard about SEMRIG, and now for a little information about this working group, which I am a co-chair of. So this is the Community Science and Outreach Working Group. And really, we are a group of individuals representing many different organizations, and we are working to advance the objectives of the larger SEMRIG group through developing outreach and education approaches to address the threats that face the Massasauga rattlesnake. And so our commitment includes hosting an annual outreach event, developing targeted and effective social marketing campaigns, and other priority activities as determined by working group members. So we are, as SEMRIG is very new, we are also very new. And I think I speak for the whole group when I say that I'm very excited to see where this goes, thanks to all of the input that I'm sure we're going to get. So again, my name is Donnell Gasparini. I co-chair this working group with Jenny Pierce. So the two of us you'll see and be hearing from today, and we look forward to co-hosting today, but also to working with you going forward. And the working group does have a total of 10 members who have been working along to sort of establish as well as to plan the workshop today. So today, of course, we are all gathered for the Community Science for Massasaugas workshop. And before we really dig into anything, just a really big thank you to the many facilitators who have been working over the past several weeks to put this together, to make sure that it is informative and exciting and just all of these wonderful things. So thank you to this group. None of this would have come together nearly as smoothly without everyone's participation. And then hopefully those of you who were here early or who have reviewed some of the materials and seen the social media posts, you will have seen that we have several speakers here today to share knowledge and experiences in different areas related to community science. So just to go through them quickly and introduce, we have James Baxter-Gilbert, a postdoctoral fellow at Mount Allison University. Hannah McCurdy-Adams, who you've already heard from this morning, who's the Reptile and Amphibian Coordinator at Wildlife Preservation Canada. We have Alana Smolares, species at risk biologist and program coordinator at Magnetawan First Nation. Nadine Perron was hoping to join us today, but was not able to, but she has still contributed to the presentation that we will hear from Magnetawan. Stephen Kell, species at risk biologist and program coordinator with Shawanaga First Nation. And Kenton Otterbein, chief park naturalist at Killbear Provincial Park. And James Paget, who's species at risk and biodiversity program officer with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. So we have a very exciting lineup of speakers and talks today, and I hope you all enjoy them. The agenda should be popped into the chat in just a moment, but just to go over it, we have our welcome, which is going on right now until about 9:30. And then we will begin with an introduction to community science and an overview of community science, which will be led by James and Hannah. Following that first talk, we will have a break for about 10 minutes. And then we will move on to 3 case studies, which really highlight community science in action and to date. So those will take place from about 10:20 until 11:20. And then the day will progress to another break, followed by an iNaturalist tutorial and discussion led by James Paget. And then we will move into closing business and remarks before concluding the workshop for the day. Now, just to bring up a code of conduct. So very simply, please be kind. We are all human. We all say the wrong thing at times. We're all learning at our own pace, and we're all coming to this space from a different point along our learning journey. And so we're hoping that everyone can just recognize this, be respectful, that we are all here to grow and to learn equitably. And we hope that everyone will be able to be inclusive. We want everyone to feel included and to feel that they have equal opportunity to participate. And we sincerely welcome that participation. So to get things started here, there will be several interactive elements throughout the day. And Hannah is going to enable the first poll, which should be through Zoom. It should show up for you in just a moment. And you'll be able to select multiple answers here. So the poll is about, what do you do that brings you to this workshop? So please select all of the options that apply to you. We have quite a mix of representation amongst different areas such as conservation, research, education, community engagement, policy development, and habitat management. So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming here from all of your various areas. All right, so this one is a little bit different. This is a Mentimeter application, so you should see something come in the chat soon that will enable you to access the link to answer this question. Why are you joining today?
There, can everyone see the word cloud now? So sorry about that. Click the wrong button. Yeah, so sorry, I'm just seeing some of the chat now. The way the word clouds work is shorter words, like shorter phrases are the ones that sort of jump out. And so yeah, there may be some word limits. But a lot of people are here because they love rattlesnakes, like the rest of us. We are definitely rattlesnake enthusiasts. People want to learn more. The people are here because they'd like to run their own projects, which is exciting, or be part of running projects, to network a bit, to participate in their community. So that's fun. If I'm not mistaken, pass the torch on to Baxter-Gilbert.
Oh my. All right. Okay, let's see if I can fumble my way through technology now. I think we're all having like a Dr. Grant experience. Like, this is very Jurassic Parky. Just hit the box a few times, we'll be okay. Share screen. Share this screen. Ooh, let's see if it works. Can folks see this one?
Yep.
Okay, awesome possums. Should I just start talking, or thumbs up? Yeah. All right. I'm already doing it. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see so many familiar names and the occasional face. I've crossed paths with many of you in some different capacities, so it's lovely to see old friends. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Baxter-Gilbert. I'm a lecturer here at Mount Allison University in today's sunny New Brunswick, which is lovely. And I'm going to be talking to you about kind of the first kind of bit of like, what is community science? And so I'd like to kind of start off with kind of framing a little bit of where I am, because I think it kind of plays a bit into, well, it's important, but also plays a bit into kind of what our conversations are going to be. So I'm speaking to you today from my office at MTTA in Sackville, where we sit on the traditional territories and unceded homelands of the Mi'kmaq. And our relationship and our kind of privilege to live on this territory was agreed upon by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1725 and 1752. And so within that framework, we're all treaty people. We all exist in this understanding that we're sharing this space. And that kind of sets the tone for a lot of what we're going to kind of talk about with community science today. And so my background in community science is kind of formed a little grassrooty and a little bit by wonderful happenstance of kind of experiences I've been fortunate to take part in, and people I've had a tremendous good fortune to kind of learn from. And so this has been from people and communities across regions in Canada, as well as Australia and South Africa, but in particular, kind of what really formalized my understanding of this. And it wasn't until kind of reflecting upon it after the fact was some tremendous experience I had working with Magnetawan First Nation a little over 10 years ago at this point. Let's say 10 years so I don't age myself too much. But this was a project where we kind of, a number of people, and either through, and you can call it whatever you like, serendipity or fate or the will of the force, came together in this project where we were able to kind of share not just our knowledge, but our interests and our questions and the gaps that we had. And we were able to kind of collaboratively work and build that so that when we were running a project that involved quite a bit of work on rattlesnakes, it was done within a framework of kind of what I was interested in as a young academic doing my master's, but also what I knew through networks and through a lot of lovely conversations around boxes of donuts and coffee about what other people were interested in, what they wanted to know, and kind of building a project that satisfied all of our interests and scratched all of our collective itches about what we wanted to know, but also allowed us all to share our own expertise. And so that was kind of the framework that really helped me start to solidify the function of community science as well as its value, which we're going to talk about all that today. And so I'd like to kind of start today's talk off by with two quotes from a pair of elders, one an elder from Magnetawan First Nation, and the other an elder from the herpetological community. So if I advance this slide, did that change? Can I just get a thumbs up that it worked? Okay, great. So this first quote comes from Elder Wilmer Naganash, who passed away a few years back in 2016. But this was hanging on the band office wall while I was doing while I was taking part in kind of the formation of this project at that time. And you can take the quote in a number of ways. I think it's applicable from a social context or a cultural context or just a human context. But me sitting there as a young master's student trained in Western science, I saw it through my own lens as well. And it kind of, and I found it quite striking that this was an idea for conservation, that we all come from the earth, we all belong here, and we all share this planet equally. And seeing it through my own lens of just how science is conducted and the value of it. You know, we do science to learn more about the world around us, and we all live in this world. And so we all come from this world, we're all connected biologically, we're all connected chemically, we're all wonderful amalgamations of stardust, right? So we share this space and we are part of it, and in acknowledging that and in knowing it, science should be a thing that's conducted far more inclusively than it ever has been, right? That like everyone is an expert in something, everyone has questions that deserve answers, and we can work together and share our what we know and what we don't to kind of bring ourselves more to this kind of equal playing field when it comes to knowing more about the world around us. And so this kind of sets a really kind of well-framed tone for community science. And then the second quote I kind of want to start. This is Justin Congdon. Many of you will know him through his amazing work on Blanding's turtle research over many decades. And he was giving a talk at the Toronto Zoo around this same time. And he was a keynote speaker, and he was talking about all the amazing life history and demographic research, and he ended his talk, and some of you may have been there at this at the Toronto Zoo Turtle Talks. I think it was like 2008, 2010, somewhere around there. And he ended the talk saying, "Never pass up an opportunity to get into an argument." And then the audience was kind of taken aback a little bit, and he had to contextualize it. He goes, obviously, you know, not a shouting match or a punch up in the parking lot or anything like that. He meant a scientific argument, right? Putting forward your idea, challenging norms. And that really is what the basis is. So then he qualified it by saying, you know, once we all start agreeing, we stop learning, right? If we all had stopped, we all simply agreed on what was known fact at one point, the earth would still be considered flat. We'd still be the center of the universe. You know, science has a long history of challenging ideas, and again, putting this within that community science framework and building on the statement by Elder Naganash, science advances itself a lot faster when we're not all thinking the same way. when we're not all seeing the world the same way, and when we're being open to ideas challenging ours. And that's where the kind of idea of collecting knowledge and collecting evidence and compiling it to grow what we know. And if we just kind of rest on our laurels of what we think is absolute truth, I mean, we know that knowledge has a half-life. So we all belong here, and we all should partake in science. And in doing so, we make science stronger. So these two kind of quotes align with this idea that kind of opening ourselves up to understanding the value of a more diverse and inclusive approach to science makes science itself better. And so when we're thinking about conservation, when we're thinking about management, when we're thinking about decision-making that impacts the snakes themselves or the ecological communities around them or the human communities that share that space too, the more we can diversify our thinking and diversify our ways of seeing, the stronger we get at kind of coming to some better understanding of the world around us. So that I wanted to kind of set the tone with these two quotes. Although that sounds big thinky, right? And many of us come from a science background. So let's jump into some literature, right? And so there was a really great paper by Charles et al. That tried to kind of work out a framework for kind of a typology for community science. And I believe it's in the folder for this session, group, today's event. Within the kind of resource folder, it's in there. Give it a read. It's fantastic. It breaks down some of these kind of key aspects that community science is based on within their definitions and their frameworks, and we can keep it as kind of as guidelines or good ideas. Every community science project will be formed with different means and intentions and outcomes, but this kind of gives us a bit of a scaffolding. It does kind of lean into kind of this idea of kind of socio-ecological systems that are based in kind of environmental management, but we can apply it to all sorts of other forms of conservation too. So how Charles et al. Described this was that community science is this kind of form of scientific research and form of research or monitoring that are based in kind of a scientific mode of inquiry, which are community-driven and community-controlled. That these are place-based knowledge and that exists kind of through social learning and kind of collective action and empowerment, right? So when we're working towards building a project and when we're working towards collecting that data and then understanding what it means, this isn't just kind of one group that's informing the rest of what happens. This is absolutely driven by kind of the communities that live around the space where this work's being done. And so it has this kind of aim to negotiate, improve, and transform governance for stewardship and for kind of socio-ecological sustainability. And although depending on what your project is, that it might not innately connect to these two things, but you're able to apply it, hopefully, to kind of what your long-term goals are. And I think when considering conducting research in a community science framework, particularly when it comes to conservation or stewardship or kind of the maintaining a population into perpetuity, which is what we all care about with Massasaugas, we want the longevity of these projects to work. And some of the power of community-driven science and community-controlled science is that research funding ebbs and flows. Researchers going through their young careers move around. There is individualness has an ephemeral form sometimes, but when it's driven by kind of these place-based, community-driven, community-controlled science, it becomes more permanent, which allows for the longevity of projects to be more successful. So when we think about this kind of approach of conducting and communicating science, we want it to be deliberately and actively engaging different aspects of our communities to guide, to inform, to participate, and to kind of use this knowledge within or this information within a knowledge framing, a knowledge sharing framework. And so again, that goes back to what I was talking about before, that everyone from all walks of life have their forms of expertise. And it doesn't matter if you're a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker. There are all of these roles that we've done and skills and insights that we've picked up along our individual journeys that can inform bigger picture things. And we see that, and we can acknowledge that in a multitude of different ways. That, like, when my car breaks, I take it to a mechanic, right? Or when my back hurts, I go to my doctor, and because they're experts in that thing that I'm not. But while you're having those conversations, you can understand what they're doing within your own frameworks as well. And if you're participating in kind of two-way conversations and sharing your knowledge while learning from theirs, the amount of understanding that can be gained really deepens. And so one thing you may be thinking of is, well, okay, is community science that different from something that we're more familiar with, like citizen science? And in some ways it's not, right? On the very surface, we can just simply think of it as a possible change in vernacular, right? And there's value in changing the words we use for things. And we, as people who work in the herp community, are very familiar with this. This isn't something new. It used to be Bufo americanus. It's now not. And the reason it's not is because really good evidence suggested that that wasn't the most appropriate word for it. That wasn't the appropriate term, because Bufo as a genus is European, and genetically they're not that close, so they shouldn't be named the same thing. Evidence helps us understand. And so with citizen science, you can think of even just the value of changing it to community, because citizen holds different meanings to different people, and historically has actually had a lot of negative connotations attached. Certain people weren't recognized as citizens despite living there, despite like there's a legal connotation to it. There's some historical and rightful baggage. So maybe citizen's not the best term. It's a lot easier to be far more inclusive with a term like community. And so just on the very surface of a vernacular change, we can understand that. But also kind of early versions of citizen science, although did a lot of fantastic things. And I'm not here to bag previous citizen science projects whatsoever. They've been amazing. They've done fantastic stuff. But when they were framed in a light of simply kind of creating awareness, or this idea of limited engagement, you go and talk to a room full of people about what's going on. That's not as much a two-way street. You're not sharing information back and forth. You're just telling them what's happening. And that limits your capacity to really root a project or root an idea within a place where it belongs. And so we can do better, right? And then this idea of kind of, you can use citizen science for sheer just increasing your data yield, right? If you put the power of logging a sighting in people's hands, anyone that encounters a rattlesnake, for example, can log where it is. There is absolute value in that. But could we go one step further to kind of share that experience a little bit more deeply? And this kind of comes down to that idea of kind of this like token sense of ownership, that, I logged a bunch of rattlesnake sightings, which was really good, but then that was where I stopped. And I don't get to kind of see where this data is going or what this data is being used for. And if it's my community where that information is being collected, I wasn't part of the conversation on why we were doing it in the first place, or maybe my answers aren't going to be addressed because I wasn't given a chance to be able. So this has absolute value. It just also has limitations, and we can acknowledge that, right? Like we can see that something's good, but something can also be better, right? And as we kicked off the start of this, we're all, or one would hope, we're all working to kind of incrementally improve, to hone our skills, to get better, to see different ways of doing things that make what drives us, which here is rattlesnake conservation. We want to be doing it as good as we possibly can, and with the longest and most meaningful impact. So we can take a good idea and keep applying more kind of reflective thought to increase our capacity to make it stronger. Another kind of thing that community-based science and community science works against is what's known as parachute science. And I don't mean the actual physical science of parachutes, because that's awesome. But instead, I'm referring to what's also termed as colonial science or parasitic science, And this is not new to Western science. For as long as people have been going on expeditions and collecting things and mailing them back to the British Museum and other museums around the world, right? Like science has been done where you just show up to an area, conduct your work, then leave and take your data with you, right? And there's a whole host of problems that we don't have enough time to break all of them down. But in short, it kind of ignores, sidelines, and devalues local expertise, local knowledge, and local experience. And this, again, from a science perspective, really narrows how much we're learning, but you're also doing it in a really jerky way, right? Like it's not good for science. It's not good from a humanity perspective either, right? And so we can do better. There's also aspects that when locals are involved, it's usually within a supportive role, or rather than as peers, rather than people that are sitting equally at a table together, discussing and thinking and conceptualizing. And so we want to avoid doing that. And again, it is not to say that if it's ever happened, you're the worst person on the planet, but we can think back to where we've been, how we've ran a project, how we've conceptualized it, how we've connected it with the communities that are there, and we can grow. And that's the important aspects that we're hoping to kind of work on and leverage. So to avoid community science, you want to look at kind of how it's often done. A lot of planning for research happens by experts beforehand. And then any local folks who are taking part of it are brought in kind of after that study is set. And again, we can work against that. It means that the people engaged in the middle part of science might be people from that community, but they're excluded from the bookends, from the planning part, and from how that knowledge is actually used. They take part in data collection, but that's just, I mean, if you think about a scientific paper, for example, we spend a lot of time thinking about why it's a really good idea to do the work. Intros can be long, and we spend a lot of time thinking about what this means for the bigger picture. Discussions are way long, and when you get to like methods and results, that can usually be pretty tightly packed. And so even just from a Western science perspective, we know the value of those bookends. They're huge in just people understanding your work. And so being only involved in that middle part excludes you from those other two. So if you want to kind of read more and kind of conceptualize this idea, there's a couple of great papers. So the problem of colonial science, parasitic and parachute research in global health, parachute science falls to earth. These are some great kind of articles to kind of help you shape your head around this issue. But at its core, the idea behind community science, and as I've alluded to, I'm sure you've already kind of came to the same conclusion, is to kind of conduct and communicate science by thinking about it more inclusively and more collaboratively. And so basically just don't be a jerk. And that is 100% easier said than done. There is systems in place that guide science to do it in the way that has been historically the way to do it. And we know that that can be problematic. And problematic from a who's involved, problematic from a how much we can possibly learn, problematic on how information is spread, and who has a right to know these things. And again, we all come from this earth, we all belong here, so we all should be able to kind of gain the knowledge that we're collecting. And so I think a great example of this is from one of Ontario's foremost naturalist, David LeGros. And he had this great story, and we were talking about some North American kind of spiritually connected creatures, particularly Bigfoot. And we were going back and forth with this Bigfoot conversation. And I've lived and worked in communities where Bigfoot is as part of the local knowledge base as a bird or a deer or a fish. But again, we were two master students, and we were chatting back and forth. And his framework was that he would be a bad biologist if he outright dismissed the potential for Bigfoot. Now, he himself admitted it's a pretty statistically likely finding a large hominid seemed really low, but it couldn't be zero, because if it was zero, then he's not being a good scientist. He's not opening his ideas up acknowledging ways of seeing and ways of knowing, and the potential has to exist, right? And this is kind of taking it to the furthest extreme, but that in many respects, in that moment, I realized he was a much better scientist than I was, at least sitting there, because he already had this framework built into his mind of the value of being open to ideas that you may innately feel you could shut down, and that shutting it down made you a poorer, or not a poorer, but a more closed-minded scientist. And so props to David LeGros. In that single instance, I think he made me a better scientist. Okay, so this process of community science, again, it's based in kind of collective scientific inquiry at a community level. It's this process of kind of bringing a plurality of knowledge together to kind of address and define a problem, to kind of build this integrative understanding. So when I kind of started working with folks in Magneto, this was exactly it. I had this project that I wanted to do that looked at kind of the highway and the amount of animals being hit by cars. But I knew members of the community from kind of other roles I had in the past. And so when I approached them, it was, hey, I got this question, and I think this location might help me find that answer. But I know you've got questions too. So can we kind of meet together, talk about the questions that we have shared, the questions that are kind of independent of each other, and how we can collaboratively work together to answer them all, right? So it was this idea of talking to members of the leadership, talking to members of the community, a lot of a very kind of conversational information sharing that allowed us to build a project that ended up being way larger than the sum of its parts. It's also rooted in this kind of place-based relationship between kind of a community's local and traditional knowledge holders and scientific knowledge holders. And this applies, of course, working in Indigenous communities with traditional knowledge, but can be applied in any community that you ever work in. And so whether it's a settler community, a refugee community, an Indigenous community, people know about their backyard and see it through different ways. And that knowledge is rooted in that location, and opening yourself up to wanting to engage people, to share what you know, and to be happy to kind of have their information, if they should care to, shared with you, helps us kind of build a larger and more full framework for understanding what we're doing. So participants engage in the scientific method as well as other modes of scientific inquiry, both recognizing and building the knowledge. And this knowledge sharing is horizontal, right? This takes away from that idea that the expert comes in and tells you what's going on, collects a bunch of data, and leaves. We're no longer needing to operate on kind of this deficit model of learning, imagining that anyone who's not an expert just has an empty head and you can shout words at them and then fill them up and then pat them and they're on their very way. This is how the educational system has worked for years, right? And it's just not a good way of learning. And we know that within building a better pedagogy. We know that when we're talking to people in a community, we know that with our friends and family. You can't just shout things at your uncle and hope he changes his mind, right? Like there's ways of acknowledging expertise, finding common ground, and sharing your information back and forth. It doesn't mean you have to always agree on every piece of information that's shared with you, but knowing it helps you frame up a better picture of the world around you. And as scientists, that's all we're doing, is trying to get that idea of what the world is and how it works. And the more perspectives we can have genuinely shared back and forth in kind of a horizontal framework, the stronger we get. Is this the end of where my talk is? Yes. All right, Hannah, this is you. I'll stop sharing.
No, thank you, Jay.
Over time has I flown?
Just while I do want folks to look at that question, so where and when should community science be used, and add your answers to the chat while we switch sharing screens.
Okay.
Where do you guys think community science should be used? Where do you guys think community science should be used? Or why do you, from listening to James, why do you think it's valuable? So when should it be used? Everywhere in the community. Folks like your talk, James. And Danelle, I'm going to try my best to only go a little bit into the break. But what you said, James, was amazing, and I really wanted to give you the time and space to say it. And your people are saying very insightful. So one thing you can think about community science is, why is it valuable? And so I'm going to go into sort of the nuts and bolts of community science. But why is it valuable? It's got value to science, individuals and participants, and to communities. And so community science is valuable to science because it increases our perspectives and way of looking at or addressing problems. It greatly expands data collection capacity. Conservation success is bolstered by public support. It also increases the likelihood of long-term continuity and project longevity, as often projects have short timeframes or are cut short. And people are saying everywhere, everything everywhere all at once. That's great. And so then community science is valuable to individuals and participants because it fosters the personal connection with nature and science. It generates personal satisfaction in knowing that your individual expertise is being acknowledged and respected. And if you're job hunting, it's actually a great thing to add to your resume. And it creates a sense of local ownership and stewardship of and of community. So, and it's also valuable to communities by allowing them to help set meaningful research goals that are applicable to them. So it empowers community to take part in generating and sharing knowledge about the world, and it creates location-specific information that can be used for data-driven decision-making and increases the likelihood of the data being used. And importantly, it prevents the community from feeling ignored, alienated, or exploited. And so why might folks be hesitant to do the level of community science we're describing? And so if you've got a pad of paper in front of you, or your phone, or a notepad on your computer, if you want to jot down some of why you might be hesitant for you to go back to and reflect on afterwards, and if you're comfortable with sharing it with us, you're welcome to put some in the chat, why you think folks might be hesitant to do this level, this type of community science. It's more work, for sure. Time consuming with limited resources, absolutely. There's public limitations on people's ability to identify cryptic species like the Massasauga. The Massasauga looks like a few other different species, yeah. It's hard to know where to start. Persecution's an issue, poaching, yep. And funding timelines are frustrating. We might come off as know-it-alls and get pushback from the residents. Yep, that definitely happens. You can find out that you don't know as much as you thought. It's a humbling experience. It definitely is. And encouraging people to get involved is quite difficult. It is. So we've got, these are really great answers, and then there's bits and pieces of what we've put this together in this slide of these answers. Residents, not presidents. That's good. So why might we be hesitant? So one of them is data accuracy. So yeah, there's challenges with the amount of information people know about how to identify something like a rattlesnake with a rattle on the tail rather than no rattle, those sorts of things. Lots of snakes have blotches. But we trust fundamental observations in other forms, like in herp review notes. And if people are genuinely and equally involved, they actually have a vested interest in learning more in this state and having accurate data, collecting and reporting on accurate data. And so keep people involved and improve this. And then of course, data security and poaching is absolutely a concern, especially for Massasauga. But if concealing location information is only effective to an extent. So there's a risk that posters will determine the locations of species at risk from our community science communications. Absolutely. But there's also a risk that local community members that find those species at risk naively share their locations to places like social media without a second thought. And so working with communities to understand the risk can actually increase the chances of safeguarding populations in perpetuity. There's a worry that habitat can be destroyed. And so knowledge is power. And with increased community knowledge and engagement, better decisions can be made about if, how, and where habitat destruction may occur. And of course, it takes more effort, but it's worth it. The continuity and longevity of a project needs a wide base of practical and logistical support. Conservation in particular takes time, and an army of caring people can lighten the load. So in Canada, we've got the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife, Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or CIWIC. And this is part of a number of different top-down approaches that we have that come generally from governments. Governments do have a strong influence on positive and negative decisions that affect conservation. And while there are issues with these, it's important to participate them and to drive the positive change that we're talking about. And the bottom-up grassroots type community science approaches can also expand the influence any one individual has. So CIWIC is an independent committee of wildlife experts and scientists that serves to identify species at risk of disappearing in Canada. And they assess wildlife species at risk of extinction. They recommend them for a status designation to governments. And the governments generally do accept those recommendations and put them into legislation like the Species at Risk Act federally or the Endangered Species Act provincially. And there's a series of conservation data centers through NatureServe Canada that hold that biodiversity information that's really important for conservation in Canada. And in Ontario, it's called the Natural Heritage Information Centre. It is managed by the provincial government, but it's also the accepted authority of that government for species occurrences, for where species exist on the land. And so we're saying this initial step of submitting your sightings is one way that you can contribute to conservation. It's relatively easy to do. And it can contribute to Massasauga conservation in Ontario to make sure that it gets to the Natural Heritage Information Centre in Ontario. And one of the tools we'll talk about later is to do this is through iNaturalist. And so now again, I'd like everyone to take a minute to think about the community where you live, or think about a community science project that you'd like to get involved in and jot it down for your future self. And in the chat, what sorts of conservation activities can you do that involve community and science? What are the sorts of things on the ground you can do? What are the sorts of actions, group activities, things like beach cleanups? BioBlitzes, yes, I'm hoping to join a few BioBlitzes this year. They seem to be ramping up again. Restoration projects, yep. Bird counts, Massasauga workshops, yes, thank you. Documenting sightings, City Nature Challenge. I think that's an iNaturalist thing as well. Education outreach at school. Yeah, so I've got a rundown of some of these. Habitat restoration and creation, wildlife rehabilitation, head starting, disease surveillance, education and awareness. And this is really important to foster that love of wildlife that we know is so important for conservation action. And it's important to learn from communities, including about local and traditional knowledge, and host volunteer appreciation events. Community science can help with performing more collaborative research. So as you're starting or improving a project, consider the quality and future utility of the data. What types of data do you want to collect and what methods will you use? Sometimes you'll need to balance data specificity with the willingness of a community to actually participate in a project. And yeah, planting native plants, Birds Canada Marsh Monitoring Program, great ideas. Backyard projects, pollinator gardens, yep. Some examples of research include biological sample collection for things like genetics and the disease analysis, assessing climate change impacts, population trends, and other landscape ecology questions. So now I'm going to launch a poll through Zoom about asking everyone how they'd like to get involved with community science. So you can either participate in an existing project or lead an existing project, or you can start a brand new one. What are you interested in? How are you interested in getting involved? Medicine walks, I love that. And so here's our results of the people that responded. We've got a lot of people that are interested in participating in an existing project. That's fantastic. But there are other people that are leading existing projects and starting new projects. And so we hope with some of the examples we're giving and some more that we're going over with this workshop, we can help all of you. And so I think I've stopped sharing and you don't see it anymore. So when you're starting, so here's more of those nuts and bolts. When you're starting a community science project, you need to determine your initial objectives and form a plan that connects perspectives, interests, and values, but leave some flexibility for change once you have the community involved. So you learn, this is one quote actually from James Baxter-Gilbert I've seen a little earlier, but learn and teach about the land, be seen at regular in-person meetings events, and be seen as something good, as in bring food. Everybody loves food. And so there's a few things to consider when you're starting, leading, or deciding to participate in a community science project. There's different regional scales. There may be particular times of year that data is collected that line up with different life history events of animals like spring emergence or mating. And bioblitzes tend to focus on finding as many species as possible over a certain number of hours or days. There's aspects of accessibility that should be considered. There's transportation, physical requirements to collect data, time commitment, equipment and software, language, training, or the level of expertise required. There's a lot to consider about data handling. And so Jenny's actually put a link in the chat of this fantastic web page I found a little while ago, and I'm actually quite excited to go through it in more detail and help with the projects that I'm involved with to get them a little bit more organized and more able to have larger beneficial impacts. So what format will you collect the data? How will the data be stored and how often is it backed up? Does it need to or will it be password protected? Will folks be able to request the data? And if so, how? Some species location data may only be publicly available at the county level or at an obscuring distance to help prevent poaching. Some data may not be allowed to leave the community or the property and be only available to certain researchers or conservation data centers. Open data is actually something to consider to make potentially unknown uses more accessible to other conservationists and researchers, and can be done in a way that still restricts sensitive information. So Jenny's just dropped another link in the chat about what open data is. And then how is the data used? Is it regularly submitted to conservation data centers or to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility that tend to have these open data policies? Will it be incorporated into graphics, figures, or artwork? There's lots to think about when starting, leading, or deciding to participate in community science projects. But in the end, it's about building community that is larger than the individual. We're far better together than we are apart. And with that in mind, this is a portion of our SEMRIG community. The SEMRIG email and contact info will be added to the chat in case you'd like to reach out, and we'll be hearing about some community science projects after the break.